Okay, hello, welcome everybody again to Republica Thessaloniki. We are now here for taxation, a really interesting issues to most people. And we're really happy that Walter made all the way to first come to Dublin for the Dublin conference and now also to Thessaloniki. I didn't say it's boring yet, so please don't leave. And all the way to Thessaloniki as well. We're really happy about that. Walter is from Open Knowledge Foundation, and he will now give a short presentation. And afterwards, we also want to take more time to also discuss with you what your ideas are on that. Thank you.
So hello, thank you for having me. I will hopefully make a not boring talk. Originally, the talk was called the most boring talk since it's about taxation. Unfortunately, it's so boring that a lot of people don't know or recognize what's going on, and basically at the end of the day it affects everybody because you need taxation or taxes to fund parts of the society. So this was the original title. As said before, we did that title in Berlin and in Dublin already, and I think the interesting part about this is because you have now 3 European countries which interconnect on different levels on in economic terms. So Dublin is the center of a tax optimization scheme called the double Irish-Dutch sandwich. In Germany, on the other side, it's like the economic power in Europe right now, and I don't have to tell anybody in the audience from Greece how difficult life can be when you have as a state a funding issue, or if your revenue is not there or your taxation is not there. So I don't know who from the audience is actually from Greece. Okay, so no, try to make explanations to my point of view to Greece and also match the numbers with Greece stuff. So actually taxation is a worldwide issue, and it's not just a European issue. This is 3 countries. We had the talk. Where do I come from? I'm from Austria. That's the schnitzel. And we had the talk, 2 friends of mine, which just started. The one is an economic professor in Harvard. The other one is doing political campaigning in Austria. And we came up with the question, what can be done since this is a big issue and it's long-term effects on the society. So the talk will be 3 parts. The first part will be mine, status quo and introduction to the worst case examples, as I call them, on tax optimization. The second part is normally the most dry part. Why is that? A historical look at it. And then the third part is what can be done. So it's an outlook for the future. And since yesterday the game started that you make references to ancient Greece, economics comes actually from oikos. And it means the family in 3 parts. The family, the house, the person living there, and also the animals. And in German you say Haushalten. And I found that funny because it used to be that economics as a field of research had certain goals, and one of the goals was to keep the unemployment low, to make sure that the country is doing halfway okay. And I think this focus it got a little bit lost over the last years, and I will go back to that. So how did I end up with taxation finding interesting? So a few years ago, I was stumbling on an article about ExxonMobil Spain, and ExxonMobil by itself is the 6th largest company in the world by market cap and revenue. And they had one guy working there for 2 years on 44,000 euros salary annually and making within the 2 years 9.9 billion euro net profit. And I found that it almost cracked me up because I think the numbers, I don't know how you connect to numbers, but that's really staggering numbers. So this guy, the John Doe from Spain, I couldn't figure out who it was. This guy actually makes more than roughly any hedge fund manager, or even Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, which are the cream of the top 1%. And then I figured out I call him the Stacken of capitalism, because this is the benchmark, and everybody else who comes in second, like Bill Gates or Warren Buffett, is a sore loser. Because he has if you go back to the slide, you see he does that for a 44,000 euro salary a year. It's not that he earns a lot of it with that, and it's also more than 4 billion euro net profit a year. It's quite something. And So what's the takeaway? Normally, if you talk about cooperation, I mean, it's understandable that all the corporations are like trying to be as little as taxes. And when you being in the league of like Microsoft or Apple, you can easily say $1 billion here, $1 billion there. At the end of the day, you're talking about real money. And so there's a certain approach to it that you limit what you can declare as taxes. Then you try to figure out how to minimize the taxes, where you have to pay them, and there's certain games in it. So the other saying is there were only two things certain in life, death and taxes. And we would like to point out that's the third thing, and that's like inequality. And we would like to try raising awareness for that, and also reducing that inequality where it is possible. And so everybody agrees normally that taxes in general are too high. The thing is, taxes are normally funding like public goods. And then it has bad reputation because everybody's complaining about taxes the one way or the other way. When you're affected of it, you're like pissed. But keep that in mind, and it's also like you should think about like it's about contributing also to the society. So in German you say like Steuern means steering, and with that what kind of taxation system you have, or what you do with the taxation money, you can actually make a society moving in one way or the other way. So this is in this whole theme of like Republica. The question would be like, what direction the European Union will go. So far, we're like a continent with a half-ass decent welfare state, which is the moment a little bit crumbling down. And the question is, do we want to keep that, or we basically say that we don't use taxes or reduce the taxes in the healthcare system? And that's like a big question where to move forward. I think Lorenzo's talk yesterday will reference later again. Also like, this is where do we want to go? Where's Europe? And I think it's important to keep that up. And part of that, whatever the discussion is, how high taxes will be and what to use it, I think that discussion should be in focus. And another important thing is, so when you have tax revenue, you normally have multiple people putting up the taxes in the society. So you have person A with amount X, you have person B with amount Y, and then you have, for example, corporation C with amount D. And as everybody knows from math in school, if let's say one amount decreases, then either tax revenue decreases as a whole, or others, A or B, has to pay up. So always remember that, and it's not no shit, Sherlock. Corporation pays less taxes, either the two others are stepping up or you're losing some services. And some services normally means like it's a number game, but it also means like affordable healthcare, it means education, it means roads, infrastructure, and so on. And this talk is only about a legal tax optimization. The bunch of illegal tax optimization on top of it, I don't want to go that much into it. In Germany, it was the fun stuff with Comex, that was like 12 billion euro. Then you had Panama Papers, which ended up like 200 billion a year. You had some Swiss tax spy fund in Germany. All the slides are already online, and when you see an underline, you can link at it, and then there's a further explanation. And so this is a reminder, this is like legal tax optimization. So this also can be changed, because the illegal stuff will be always hard to actually track down and avoid. And the quote from Barack Obama said it, a lot of this is legal, but that's exactly the problem. And so we came up with this is legal, illegal, scheißegal, which means like in German, hope this first two ones you understand, and the third one doesn't matter. And here you have like then certain actors in the game, Juncker, Schäuble, the German finance minister, Tsakalotos, which is the Greece finance minister. So that's not gravity we're talking about. It's like a question of the society. What do you want to do? How you want to do something? And this should be discussed in order to make the society better. And on top of it, why this is now at the moment, I didn't know that sounds. That's like the robot just moving, making the mail stuff. Anyway, we're moving towards a world where you have like the question how you sustain the society in the future when AI, robots, digitization and so on steamrolling the production field. And whatever you want to call it, if you want to have like a universal basic income or a universal basic outcome, you need to discuss that how you fund the society, how you make sure that people have an education. And the slogan here is like from Andresen, who is like one of the big venture capitalists, software's eating the world. So think over like how in the future you want to have like a state or an organization who takes care about basic services. And this is like this funny like parcel distribution center in China. So the general trend on this, as you can see, we have like corporate income taxes as a share of GDP. That means like how much of the GDP comes from corporate taxes. And as you can see here, that's a downline trend. The same thing as you have here, the effective tax rate. So both of them, and that's like a long-term trend. We are talking here like coming from the 40s, 50s. Here we're like the last 30 years. And both are going down. That means like some tax revenue is gone missing, or as we say, absent without leave. So that's like the way how they try to minimize taxes. And I think you should always think about when it comes down to tax evasion or optimization, it's like hacking. It's like hacking a code, right? You have on the one side, you have like this tax Bible, what the IRS or your finance authority wants to have. And then on the other side, you have like hackers, which are like then suits or lawyers who does like 24/7 nothing else is finding the loopholes. And it's not just that they're finding the loopholes, and in some countries they even writing the loopholes, which is like the icing, the creaming on the ice when you have outsourcing the legislation that companies who help big corporations are actually writing then like the law. So this is a mega, as normally saying when it comes to hacking, it's almost like an exploit. It's a backdoor. And so you have 4 big hacking teams. That's like PricewaterhouseCoopers, KPMG, Ernst & Young, and Deloitte. And they're making a bunch of money. I mean, that's like the 2 numbers here is like for the US. So the US companies are having oversee like 2 trillion in dollar. And so the US is missing annually like 60 billion on like tax revenue. And so it's a lot of dough, or as we say in German, Batzen Geld. And for Europe, the estimate is basically like between 50 and 60 billion a year. Taxes are gone. To give you an example, that's like 1/6 of Austria's GDP. That means like 1/6 of a GDP means like you're working 2 months for nothing. That means like 7 million people working 2 months for nothing because somebody's not willing to change the tax loopholes. In terms of Greece, that's like 1/3. So 4 months, Greece is working for the European tax loophole. And the OECD called it egregious, which is in their term pretty strong word. They did a great study on like how to avoid that. I will get back to later what the solution would be. And the one thing is, why is this happening lately over the years? Because you're moving from real goods to intangible goods, which are like intellectual property, patents, search algorithms, for example, for Google, or displaying ads, which you can easily transfer across border because they're not physical anymore. And another trend is what you see here, that's the changes in the last 11 years. So you had the biggest companies worldwide used to be ExxonMobil, an oil company, General Electric, which is producing engines and stuff like that, Microsoft, the only IT company here, British Petrol, oil again, and Citigroup, banking. Now you could say 11 years later, Citigroup is gone, at least one bank less, yes. But you have then on the other side, you have like 5 tech companies. And for those tech companies, like moving their intangible goods or products, it's way easier than you move, for example, for ExxonMobil, like an oil refinery around. Because this is like real shit they're doing. And this is something which is like on a server, which then can zip-zap around worldwide. That's one of those big movements why that changed. And I will go quickly into one of those tax loopholes, which is called a double Irish and a Dutch sandwich. And the reason why it's called like that, because you need like 2 Irish companies and 1 Dutch company, where you're basically bouncing back and forth the revenue or the profits. Oops. So this is, I put up this Chinese version because it normally feels like that you're looking into something like that. Over here I have a more detailed description. You can easily remember that. How that works is, for example, you have like an increase. You want to put up some online ad for, let's say, Republica conference. You pay then for the online ad, let's say on Facebook or on Google, but you don't pay it in Greece. Basically, you pay it like to some Irish company. That Irish company transferred then the money to some Netherlands companies. That Netherlands company transfers the money to some Irish company, which is halfway owned in a tax haven in the Bermudas again, and then it goes back or doesn't go back to the US. So that's what you normally have, how that stuff works with either patents and other things. And you have different schemes like that, and it's pretty much like every big tech corporation does this. And in Europe, normally you blame the US corporations. There's also one SAP, the only German real IT company. They do it as well, and they also have here, for example, Starbucks. So this is basically every big corporation does that. And there's one example with Google. So over here you have, as an explanation, how big the damage is. You have like Google has world at 46 billion euro revenue, and for UK, the revenue you can see here is like 4.6. So you could roughly say it's like 10% of the revenue is UK. And when you look at the profit worldwide, you have then like 10 billion profit, and at the end of the day in UK the tax paid is only 30 million, while worldwide with all the tax optimization it's only 2.3. So you can say like here you like somewhere around 7% instead of where you should be. That should be roughly around like 200 something million. And why I put up the peanuts here? Because once you have like this money machine gone, you can easily like support fun initiatives like this digital news initiative from Google, which then drop out like 150 million a year in the European news organization market for innovative things. And it's peanuts in that way because it's like not much, and also they buy a lot of influence with it. So 2 weeks ago there was like the big screamer in the US again, and somebody got fired in their job because basically they were cheering for the European Commission to go after Google. And that's basically what once you have a lot of money, you do a lot of things. I mean, that's a natural. The other story is Apple. Basically, over the years, they have $250 billion in cash. Again, that's like 2/3 of the GDP of Austria or 2/3 of the debt of Greece. So that's just cash sitting somewhere in the Bermudas from Apple, which you can't bring back because then they have to pay taxes. Then we go back to Ireland. There's like this beef between Ireland and the European Commission, because the European Commission basically told Ireland that they have to get 19 billion from Apple. Apple is refusing to pay the money, and Ireland is trying to get the money because it's basically their business model as a country. And when people ask, like, so what's happening with this Irish-Dutch sandwich? Yes, 2014, they scraped the infamous double Irish tax loophole. So you could say, woohoo, buddy. And the Bambi, this shy animal, which symbolizes the capital, always have to go there where it's quiet, has to go somewhere else. But then later, it was figured out that it is replaced. So basically, it's the same thing. It works the same thing. It just has a different name, and it's called like knowledge box or patent box. And also, like they got like 6 years of changing the rules, and can then jump into this one. So this is pretty much like it will continue, and it will cost the European society a lot of money. And I'm not just talking about like Ireland, or this affects like other countries like Hungary, Netherlands, Switzerland. This is one of my favorite examples where you had 2015 in December, one company being sold for 40,000 Swiss francs, and another 1 hour later it was sold again for 6.4 billion. So that's like 60 minutes, and you had like effects of 167,000. In case you're wondering what's big number, 167,000, that's basically like you work in your whole life 1.5 hours. That's it. That's 165,000. Or you walk 1 kilometer, and while you're walking the 1 kilometer, you're spinning around 4 times the earth. So that's like a huge increase for 1 hour for not much happening. Besides that, why did this happen? You are moving the companies around, as you can see here, and you're reducing the tax rate from 18% to 2%. And then you easily like save a lot of money on top of it. So that's happening in Europe all the time, pretty much. We have Ikea, we have Luxembourg leaks. I don't want to bore you that much, but like the hilarious part in this, the Luxembourg leaks was that you could see like how it's working. B, it was done by Juncker while he was Prime Minister of Luxembourg, and he's now the head of Europe. And if you look in the slides, you see then like this funny video from the European Greens, how they explained the Ikea tax loophole. So what can be done at that point? You need like a transparency data value chain. Like you need beneficial ownership, that you can figure it out who owns a company, who is paying what and when. And there are certain initiatives trying to tackle that down. The one is open ownership, and the other one is EITI, that's extractive industry transparency initiatives. And the problem with both of them is like once you have like it's a chain, and once you have a weak link, then it's broken. And at the moment you have Germany pretty much like standing out as like a broken one of the broken links, because there's no open beneficial ownership transparency register. And there's now the second part starts, normally done by Max Kasi. I just also want to quickly point it out, the Welsometer we did. That's like where you're standing in the income distribution, because last week the new data came up from Europe, and you can click on the countries and then you can see where you're standing, because those who don't pay taxes get more wealth. So how does an international tax normally work? So there's three models. The one is like you have a source country-based system. The other one is arm's length pricing, and the third one is bilateral treaties. That was established after the 1920s. And the first one is basically corporations owe taxes on the production where it happens. So imagine you have a car company in Germany producing cars, then the corporate taxes has to be paid in Germany. Since over the years it got more complicated, and then you have like a production chains. That means you could have like a car with parts from France and Austria. They created the system called arm's length pricing, which means like you every national subsidiary is an independent company, and you're paying on the market prices up for things. This is important because with car parts it was easy to say like a tire costs amount X. If you now think about like Google, you have the problem that you don't know how much is the search algorithm worth. Or with Starbucks, you don't know how much is the brand worth. The same with Ikea. So in the example with Ikea, why they lower the taxes that easily? Because they say like 3% of their whole revenue has to be paid in some weird scheme for the brand of Ikea. You can't argue much about it because you don't know how much the Ikea brand is worth. And that's like where you don't have a real market price anymore, because you only have like one supplier on the brand. And so this is creating problems. On the first one, you try to move production around where it's cheaper. So you're moving a production from Germany, let's say, to Czech Republic, Poland, or wherever the tax rate is lower. And on arm's length pricing, you shift the profits around. That's where you have the big issues there. Bilateral treaties is the one, the Dutch-Irish sandwich. There you send in basically a bunch of lawyers who exploit or hack the tax code and figuring out how you layer that up. And that's basically where the jump around didn't work, the animation. So we go back to that, why corporations pay taxes anymore. So first they make up the prices to shift the profits around, so you don't know how much it is worth. And the other one is moving actual production. And that's basically leads to the third big issue. You have then like a tax competition between the countries, because understandably each country tries to get a share of the tax revenue. And in order to attract a company to go there, you basically lower the taxes. So this one you have then here, what's happened over the years. It's like the last 30 years where you start at the top, which is up to like a corporate tax rate from 60% and going down, or the Irish case, it was like here 50, and then you end at 12.5%. So that's the trend, because everybody tries to attract different countries. And what can be done about it? There's a pretty simple solution. It's called a sales-based apportionment. So basically it requires multi-corporations to announce how much profit they make, and also like what's the revenue share in a country. So you have amount X, what is your profit? And then they say like in Greece, you got 10% out of it. So you pay then for this like 10%. And the thing is like, you can't move around the customers, right? They will be paying the ads in Greece when they're sitting here for a local conference or for other goods. And the other big thing about this one would be each country could start to introduce that new system by itself. Because the big thing is like who moves first and how to coordinate like a European-wide effort. So that's at the moment the best candidate. And then the third part of this talk is like, how do we get there to get like a new system? You can pray and hope that praying helps. This one is then the second one is like from the Greece local guy. I don't know who knows him. Yeah, he's the CFO of the church, and he basically does a whole great article about from Michael Lewis on like how the church in Greece also does like tax dodging to a brilliant level. Or you can laugh. I mean, was in Dublin. There's like this hilarious Anglo tapes where you basically can hear the conversation about a bank CEO with his financial officers, how they got the bailout from the government, which is like, if you're not on the receiving end, it's really funny. And actually the graphic comes from this, and it's called like a Trickle-Down Economics. And why trickle-down? Because those who don't pay taxes, corporations pay something, and that's basically ends up normal like in a concentrated wealth. And the theory there in the 80s was like where this whole downward shift started, that everybody will profit from the trickle-down thing. So this is a quick remember from the Greece crisis. Just for the non-Greece people, so that was, the black is 2009, the exposure for German or French banks, and that's 2014. And you can clearly see that 2009 was high, 2014 was a little bit lower. And what happened there is that you had like a bailout, and the bailout went to the banks. So you had like only around 11% of this bailout trickled down to like the Greek population, while the perception in the rest of Europe was that you bailed out like a nation and also the population. So going back to that trickle down, I find these two graphics like really interesting to give a short summary how this works. And what you can see here, this is like starting at the beginning of the 80s, normalized, and then you go up, like here it's the top 1% income share, and that's the other things. And as you can see here, there's a negative change. And that's basically happened when you're claiming like something Reaganomics or trickle-down economics is working. And I think that's important because taxation and the rate of taxation itself is not a single core issue, it's also wider connected. So what you should remember from the talk, that roughly €100 for each European citizen a year is going to waste with the tax loopholes. Or if you're a Greek person, remember it's like €5,000 annually. So what you can do, I mean, that's pretty straightforward. You support your local, regional, national investigative journalists or politicians or parties or members to the European Parliament, NGOs or campaigns who are working on it. And you should consider this is like always like a cost-benefit issue, because one country is benefiting from the other, so it needs a bigger combined effort. And the bigger combined effort, it's combined also, it grows over the time, right? You have like this happening each year. Each year you have like 50 to 70 billion. Each year you, as a Greek person, you're wasting €5,000 on like gone taxes. And this combines then with this trend of like what you have debt in countries. And that's like a overview from the last years. So what here it's important, you have like before the financial crisis, somewhere here, it was more or less stable. And now imagine each year you grow the debt by 0.5% because of tax loopholes. And for some people, the 0.5% of like what's gone there, it's not that much, but this things adds up over the years. So when you look at the graphic like this, and you have like somewhere around 20 years and 0.5, then you have like a 10% difference in total debt. And then you pay interest on top of it. So this, every year you put up a nice small layer, which makes things more difficult. And another thing to remind is always like from the trickle-down economics or what's happened in beginning somewhere in the 80s, this is like the split of like, which used to be go along on productivity and average real earnings. So you have like a constant like productivity growth, but the real wages on that somewhere went missing. And part of it, this is going down to the root of like where's the profits are going, and they're going this way down. So you end up, if you're not living from interest, you end up like on this line, and the other one goes up. And some people claim that says goes together with like the union membership and how much the top 10% is income growing. And this is just like to wrap up this like a little bigger picture that's not just taxes. I know it's for some people maybe a little bit confusing or too fast. You can look at the slide, and we're coming back to taxes. That was brand new from Gabriel Zuckmann. He's one of the PhD students from Piketty. Came out yesterday, as I think. And here you see what it's like the percentage of a GDP of money from a country being somewhere in a tax haven. So here you have, for example, Greece, and you can see when you go over there, it's like somewhere on the 35%. That means like 1/3 of the Greece GDP, that's like roughly 100 days working, is somewhere hanging around in the Bahamas, in the Bermudas, or wherever, and is missing here for pay like for health services. And the other thing is like, we're not talking about like the traditional tax havens, which are like Bahamas, Bermudas, but you have here like Switzerland, then you have Hong Kong, then you have the USA, then you have Singapore, and you have, for example, Germany on number 8. So it's not like you're talking about just Panama, Marshall Islands, and stuff like that. This is like an index from how tax havens and financial secrets are lining up with countries. There you have again the US, up there you have then like Switzerland, and the size shows like how big it is. And this is the trend changes of the tax havens. And you still see like in Europe, we're talking about like 1/4 of all tax havens are based in Europe. So we shouldn't point at like in other destinations, but first of all, taking care about this line and then our beloved neighbor. And this is a political question. And we could easily like do things like that. We had like a few years ago in 2012, Draghi announcing he puts out the bazooka, means like whatever it takes to solve like the euro crisis. And I think like the euro crisis on a level of difficulty and urgency is way higher than fixing a little loophole on the tax code. And so that's my thinking. It would be doable if you like it. I mean, that was also the euro crisis, which I found it funny, which you call structural reforms, has been implemented. It was for Greek people here, they might get the joke. And then this one has all the other days. So in the US, they always say like the corporations are people. Why they are not a death penalty for corporate companies like Mulan? It's like some company who raised the prices 400%, and basically the product wasn't worth it, and it's like in the healthcare sector. The other day you had Equifax, which basically had a data breach, and on top of that the company sucked pretty bad at having data breach. They also had then like insider trading going on. And I don't know who remembered Enron, classic one. So when I saw this one putting a corporate death penalty, not in favor of death penalty, but corporate death penalty, I found quite amusing. And it also needs, in order to gain knowledge about it, I think it needs to have more understanding in the broader society. So I always tell people I know, look at The Big Short. I mean, it's a hilarious pop culture movie, well done, great entertainment. And you sometimes understand in how this is going, what means too big to fail, what we had with the banks, then too big to justice, what we had with the banks again. HSBC got caught like on money laundering, didn't have to do anything afterwards. And my favorite one, the I will be gone, you will be gone. So basically you have incentives in that industry on banking, tax evasion, where you're making deals, and once the deal is actually into effect, you will be somewhere else and you don't feel like any burden with it anymore. That was part of it, like how this whole financial crisis went down. And the other thing is you should always consider it's about framing In the US, they changed the estate tax to death tax, and once it was relabeled in a different name, people thought that like, oh, you can't tax that person. In Europe, we would have what I saw lately was like they call it tax refugees, and basically you make a certain kind of pointing it out or publicly labeling people or companies who are trying to avoid those taxes. I think that could work. Some campaigns lately were like the Star Bucket Challenge, which was successful in Germany, halfway done by a broadcasting station, never made it outside of Germany, interesting enough. And then the Ikea tax avoidance campaign, where basically you got a typical Ikea instruction manual, just this time like how many stores you have, what you need to, that you need 4 tax havens and how you screw that then together. And why is this everything I'm just talking about important? Because basically you shouldn't land on the taxpayer as a company. It used to be that as a company you get a reward for the risk you take, and if you take a risk and it doesn't work out, then you also take the downfall, and this doesn't happen anymore. So we had the banks and financial industry getting bailed out. We're getting some energy companies bailed out at the moment, and it's not sustainable in the long run. And so from the talk, one of the talks yesterday, they were talking about solar punk. I thought then like, well, it needs like something like a Titan, and this Titan Themis from the Greek. That's the solar punk version. And what you have here is the scale, and this is even. So it means like you need a tax revenue which is constant. You can't like put everything on the one side. And Lorenzo was saying Europe exists in the practice of, and I say tax solidarity, not for the purpose of tax optimization itself. And then we're moving toward that way. The remark is, this is not rocket science. We used to have a tax system which was working back in 30 years ago. And so it's not rocket science. And that's the things you should take away. There's 3 ways how companies are paying less taxes. It's based also like that you're now having more intangible goods like patents, search algorithms. It's roughly 0.5 of the European BIP, 0.4 something. And every time you have like some tax optimization scheme, you should think about ka-ching. Because if it makes ka-ching on the one side, if somebody's like avoiding the tax, that it makes ka-ching somewhere else and you have to pay for it. And yeah, that's towards Europe, the space that it doesn't get lost and gets even better, hopefully for a bigger society. And the other day I thought this great quote, we bear responsibility to be successful. And because we're doing this, because there is actually an alternative, and that was the one Lorenzo pointed out yesterday, Theresa May's citizen of nowhere. So in order to avoid going the one way, we should at least try to tackle a few things this way. I think avoiding the tax optimization, the legal one, not even the illegal one, is a pretty easy task, and hopefully it will be done. So laugh out loud, love taxes, love Europe, and I say thank you for having me. And the slides are online, and if you have any questions, please let me know.
Wonderful. Thank you, Walter. Does anybody have a question that you want to pose publicly? We have 15 minutes left in this session, so yeah, we have enough time.
Thank you for that. That was fascinating. I am not a full-blown economist, but just one question. If we were to implement your sales-based tax system, what would the effect be on the producing countries? I'm thinking of Poland, Romania, Bangladesh, India. Would that leave them with less taxes or more if the taxes are being paid in the countries where goods get sold rather than produced?
I mean, there's that was the one optimized version for focusing on IT corporations. The European Commission also had them like that you just don't split it up on like the sale itself, but also you consider like if you have production facilities. So you can broaden it up that you say if you have like the car is produced there, then a quarter goes into half of it goes into where the production is happening. I just brought up this one because it's easy and it's not too technical.
Also, probably not so much taxes are paid in Bangladesh at the moment, right?
I mean, the talk focused mainly on IT companies for that reason, because they are using that loophole more. Bangladesh, you ran into also other issues with tariffs when they try to bring in close to Europe.
Okay. Thanks for this very interesting talk. I just have a question. So you mentioned various civil society organizations who are fighting tax avoidance. Can you maybe tell us a bit more? Which one would you say is the most effective one who really has like this European agenda?
So the one big one is Tax Justice Network. They also had like this one ranking of like where the tax havens, where it's not just like this like tropical islands. They're doing a decent job. The problem is always like how to basically get it down on track on like country-based, or the other thing is in 2019 you have then the European election. So ideally that tax avoidance or optimization would be election topic on a European scale, because it affects whole Europe. It's like understandable that one country like Luxembourg or Ireland in this case have an incentive of lowering the taxes or playing the scheme, but at the end of the day, I think as an analogy, you have to come up with saying something like this really affects the continent, and you have to find a solution together. It's like the same thing with like on a scale of complexity is like distributing or finding the key for distributing refugees, like how many can go to one country, and half of the countries are like refusing to take refugees, although they are obliged by common agreement. Will be probably the same with taxes.
Okay, so I'm standing next to Lorenzo, our keynote speaker, and before you can ask your question, I want to ask you, will this be a topic for DM25 for the campaign for the European elections?
I think this needs to be a topic for anybody who wants to stand up for common sense and a basic sense of decency ahead of any national or European election. And for sure, DiEM25 as a movement that is based around common sense and a deeply heartfelt sense of justice will make this, and is already making this, into one of its keynote demands ahead of 2019. But I think it's really important to perhaps underscore that there is really nothing partisan or radical about any of this. It is just plain common sense that this system should be fixed, and this is criminality, and our countries are condoning, if not even supporting, that criminality. This was my question, in fact, which is really connected, Sandra, with what you asked. I read this report from the European Parliament, I forget which committee, from 2014 or 15, I think, and it was while they were trying to get some tax harmonization or closing some loopholes at European level, and the European Parliamentary Committee said, we have found a systematic work of censure and blockage on the part of nation states and national governments during the entire process of the work of this committee. The nation states have refused to share sensitive data with us. We believe the level of lack of cooperation that national governments have showed even goes against what the law in the European Union should actually guarantee. And anyway, the gist of it was that national governments were very much the problem in reaching any tax harmonization or closing any of those scandalous loopholes when it comes to the European Union, whereas the European institutions were really trying to push for something like that to happen, even if, as you rightly said, Juncker is right at the moment at the head of it. Maybe he saw the light and decided to change his mind. But to what extent, in your experience, is there really an outright role of national elites, national governments, national states in blocking any move towards a European harmonization on this issue? And why do you think so many national governments are so willing to go against the immediate material interest of their own citizens in order to protect the interests of multinationals? What do they get out of it?
So the last one I can only speculate because I don't understand it, why they're doing it. No, it puzzles me because it's like really short-sighted. And I know from Austria that we have a finance minister who is one of those roadblocks to get anything done in Europe when it comes down to avoiding tax loopholes or having transparency on it. And it's, I think it needs more blaming and pressure on those persons. I think the topic by itself is as I said with the title, it's boring, so most people will fall asleep. The numbers don't stick. Everybody thinks it's like doesn't affect them in that way, and well, at least that's my experience. And you had over the years, you had LuxLeaks, then you had the Panama Papers, then you had some other crazy stories. You know it by heart from as soon as it comes something down with Eastern or oil money, that there is corruption and so on. But it does not stick for some reason. And they get away with it. You should normally have like Schäuble. You should ask him, so when we're talking about Greece, I mean, there was this big fuss about Greece for whatever reasons, and it's complex, but compared to that tax loophole, Greek is like peanuts. I mean, we saw the comparison of how much it would be. So you can run like for years a deficit in Greece where nobody can give a shit about it because it doesn't even matter. So imagine you would put out that money in Greece. What you have is the tax evasion scheme. And then imagine the outrage which Greece caused in Europe compared to like that thing which goes on legally. That was, I never understood. I mean, this whole campaign in Europe is how they framed Greece as sometimes lazy taxpayers not up to date with the IT system in order to get taxation and so on. That was like a big outcry in one way. And it's nothing compared to that was happening like in the heart of Europe, so in Luxembourg, in Ireland, where I can explain it that there's a lot of interest in certain people who are actually benefiting from it, and that's actually not so much the corporation by itself, because I think the corporations by themselves actually the money they save there, they go there now as dividends on the stock markets. So it's basically those who own the stocks, and that's what I meant. You should put a corporate death penalty just as a threat, as a credible threat in there for saying if you fuck up, you pay the burn. I think that was I mean, the stuff is you're landing on the taxpayers. It's always happening, and people don't realize it. Or, I mean, it happens to me. I forget about it, how bad this thing was. B, I'm like, they never can be that big assholes, right? Until you realize again what they did before. And then you have, for example, in Germany now, you have the taxpayers coming up with the money for like the old energy industry. So if you have like atomic power plant, the cleanup will be ending up at the taxpayers. If you go down to coal, you have the same things, and there's no outrage. And it's like billions for like an industry which manages to get along with it. I think that's the mechanism is always the same. So I don't know how you can keep up the outrage or put pressure on a single person to make sure that this person or finance minister has to do something. So I'm lost at that. I think the two campaigns are good. It needs to be, I think, addressed in the next 2 years. And I don't think it's, I mean, besides from real politics about the negotiations by itself, it's not rocket science. It's straightforward. And I think also the majority, if they would know about it, is pissed because you have to come up either with paying instead of the corporations. And that's like this change of like people having a real wage and the other ones living from capital interest. Either you pay up for it or you have less services. And this less services, especially in Greece, you saw the numbers, through austerity, what you have to implement then actually costs life. So it's not just like some funny graphs with some funny animation. It has a real effect. And I think this connection should be drawn, or people have to realize it. And that's why you have to understand this ongoing scheme. It's not that it's like a one-term thing. I mean, this stuff happens for 30 years, and sometimes it accelerates, sometimes you have then a bubble, sometimes the bubble bursts, sometimes you realize it, sometimes you don't. But you have like a long-term major shift, and it's not just short-term effects, it's eroding basically the whole system, what you call Europe as a, in comparison to the US, has a welfare state, and that will be incredibly threatened by it. And the alternative you pointed out the other day, yesterday, is then like you have like an Asian model. And so the question is, if you have these competing systems, which one you want to have? And I think people should realize that. And I think that's like somewhere where Europe could stand out of like navigating to a space which is halfway based on solidarity.
That's almost like a good word for the end of this session, but we still have one question. So I would give the microphone to you and one last answer, and then we can go for the not public discussion on the topic.
Okay.
So there is a study in USA that says that there is correlation between corporation tax and GDP growth. So basically, lower the tax, higher the GDP, higher the growth, higher the revenue, but people don't get that money, so as you said, but they mainly live good enough. And there is only ethical question on this topic. Do you agree with this, that it's good and for the corporations and for the country and for the government, etc.?
So I don't know the study. I know that within that realm something this arguments comes up. I mean, the question is how long does this work? The question is also what kind of society you want to have. So if you think export something to another country, that works fine. If you live off dividend, it works fine. At the end of the day, I think you should be able to fund a universal healthcare. You should have like education system. So basically, once you're born with the family you grow up, doesn't depend like your chances of ending up somewhere in university or having a job. That's the short version. So if you let me know the study, I can take a look at it. Even the US is going down on this like corporate tax optimization stuff. And the funny part is that in the US, it's even like 35% compared to Europe, which is actually high up. I mean, they do another optimization stuff, but by itself, it's compared to the European Union quite high. So the question is if it doesn't only goes towards the US, and if you have like other trends which are making the GDP growth. That's I can't say because I don't know the study.
Okay, so you maybe speak to each other
Yeah.
afterwards. That would be great. Thank you, Walter, again. Thanks
my
for
pleasure.
giving this talk and educating us all about taxation, which is a really important and really not so boring topic.
Yeah.
We now have a 15-minute break, and then we continue with digital society in Arabia. So we have a few speakers who will, tell us about the startup culture, the digital culture in their countries. Thank you.